Many of you have traveled from far. Hopefully you've quickly got over jet lag and you're bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, ready to go this morning. I'm your chair for this session. I'm Sonia Stanley Nile, and I would like to extend a warm welcome also to our panelists. 4 of them are present. We're missing 1. To my knowledge, Mercy Dio isn't here, so we will proceed with 4 speakers. Let me now invite Jason Robinson, who is going to present the paper, Dubbing the Reggae Nation, Transnationalism, Globalization, and Interculturalism. We will proceed in the order as it appears in the program. So we'll have Marvin next, Colin, and then Michaela.
A simplified form of the national language of Ethiopia to express Rastafarian worldview centered on a, quote, land far away, a mythological homeland, and a nation of sorts. Rather than imagine this as the goal of a literal repatriation, we might instead view this language as a form of transnationalism, as a way of linking with other black popular cultures around the world. Without lyrics to provide a basis for the meaning of the song, McCook's instrumental version of Sata, his dub version, reflects important conjunctures within the African diaspora and the flexible code switching prevalent in global black popular cultures. McCook's performance approach is sound on the tenor saxophone and his improvisatory approach to solo illustrates connections between African American jazz performance practices and the early influences of reggae. McCook attended the Alpha Boys School in Kingston, whose music program was directed by his sister, Mary Ignatius Davies. McCook studied alongside some of the most influential jazz-educated horn players in Jamaica in the 60s and 70s, including Don Drummond, Cedric Brooks, and a host of others. These musicians were the founding core of the Scotalites and provided a link between jazz, which had declined in popularity on this island after World War II, and emergent forms of Jamaican popular music. Seen in this light, Mandela, the song, activates important links between Jamaican popular culture and African American music, illuminating the flow of sounds, ideas, and performance practices between locations in the African diaspora. Perhaps this is inevitable. As Stuart Hall argues, black popular culture is, quote, always conjunctural. It persistently upsets a politics of authenticity regulated by narrowly conceived concepts of race, place, and national belonging. As a dub version of Sata, Mandela strategically recasts the song's original meanings through remixing, adding new parts and creating an ethereal semblance of the original. Loretta Collins claims that, quote, hegemonic discourses and sound fields are destabilized by the improvisation of sound repertoires of emerging nations. I'd like to suggest that we take this one step further. Reggae itself has produced a more metaphorical, more conceptual nation, a trans-nation, as I call it, begin to argue, forged through new musical practices and embodied by the growing number of musicians and listeners around the world to whom reggae is a defining aspect of their lives. As the title of my talk suggests, we might draw from 3 interrelated discourses to help understand the complex identity politics at play in the globalizing of reggae. First, I'm drawn to the analysis of globalization that celebrates heterogeneity and difference. This is what James Clifford describes when he claims that the, quote, pure products go crazy. For Clifford, individual identities in the globalized world are always hybrid and complex and usually upset assumptions about authenticity. This is what he means by the pure products go crazy. Moreover, the global community of reggae performers and listeners challenges orthodox views of transnationalism. Alejandro Cortez, Luis Guarnizo, and Patricia Landau maintained that, quote, this field is composed of a growing number of persons who live dual lives, speaking 2 languages, having homes in 2 countries, and making a living through continuous regular contact across national borders. More than the concept of diaspora, transnationalism, this kind of transnationalism, seeks to understand the relationship between immigration and national identity. On the other hand, the reggae transnation is grounded in a different rhetoric of nationness, a rhetoric less connected to specific political and geographic nationalisms. It references nation without the nation, a nation without geographic coordinates. In other words, if transnationalism highlights the global dispersal of people who share a common ethnic or national origin, where is the reggae nation's origin? Where does it exist today? What is the role of place in such a virtual nation? How might it intersect or be informed by ideas about diaspora, Pan-Africanism, Pan-Latin Americanism? How might these discourses provide concepts of nation that diverge from current thinking about transnationalism? And how does music function as a technology of creating, maintaining, and challenging ideas about the reggae nation? I'd like to suggest that we draw on the practice of dub to theorize answers to these questions. The reggae nation might be found in its creative rearticulation, its echoing, in a manner similar to that produced in the delays, filtering, panning, and frequency modulation, common in dub mixing techniques. Literary and music scholar Louis Chude-Soke offers some remarkable insights in this direction through his work on the echo chamber and its relationship to shifting meanings of Africa and reggae. Chude-Soke argues that, quote, the cultural practices of memory assert Africa as both multivalent signifier and historical legacy still central to black narrative. However, it is true that the echoes of Africa that are New World black cultures have now bounced back, creating a complex scenario that can best be grasped by the metaphor of an echo chamber. And he talks about this in the context of the emergence of slackness and dancing. I'd like to adopt the metaphor of the echo chamber, one of the earliest devices used to create reverb and delay effects, as a methodology for mapping globalization and transnationalism in reggae discourse. In a sense, I'd like to dub transnationalism to explore the spatial dynamics suggested by the echo, reverb, flange, and decay that makes up reverberations. I'd like to suggest that the reggae nation manifests itself in the same kinds of reverberations. The term itself, reggae nation, is persistently common in reggae discourse, but rarely theorized. Although it has great symbolic flexibility, it's frequently invoked in reference to a transnational community of listeners, musicians, and others. This transnationalism articulated in numerous playful ways, ranging from spiritualistic references steeped in Rastafarianism to slick product marketing directed towards an international consumer base. The spectrum of meanings is embodied in a video released by a web-based company called Reggae Nation, whose 2004 video Reggae Nation Island Movement combines recent reggae recordings with footage of surfing, utopian images of island lifestyles, live music performances, and interviews with various reggae artists from around the world. The term's also used by a German recording and concert production company and a Guyanese reggae group, just to cite a few examples. I'd like to argue that this transnationalism, if we can call it that, was evident in the earliest years of the internationalization of reggae. The 1970s emergence of Ivorian vocalist Alpha Blondy is an excellent example. Born Seju Kone to Morocco, Cote d'Ivoire, the Ivory Coast, Blondy attended college in Cote d'Ivoire, Liberia, and then briefly lived in New York in the mid-1970s. During his stay there, Blondy sang with various groups and attended a 1977 concert by Burning Spear. This reportedly had a dramatic impact on the young singer. Within a couple of years after his return to Abidjan, he launched his music. Because of his rising popularity in Francophone Europe, Blondy moved to Paris in 1984, where he signed with Pathé Marmonique, subsidiary of BMI. In Paris and London, Blondy recorded his second full-length album, Cocody Rock, in which he recorded the title track here in Kingston with the Wailers Band, then which was reorganizing under the bassist after Marley's death in 1981. This international African diasporic collaboration between Blondy and the Wailers Band is extremely important. Although the symbol of Africa was central to Rasta-informed roots reggae, there was relatively little collaboration between reggae artists and continental African artists during the prolific roots reggae years of the 70s. At the same time, Marley's music had become the soundtrack for various liberation movements in post-colonizing Africa. Marley's invitation to perform at Zimbabwe's 1980 independence celebration is one evidence of this. For many young West Africans coming of age during the 70s, such as Blondy, Rasta-inspired roots reggae promoted a message of Rastafarianism, resistance, and liberation that spoke directly to their hopes and aspirations. It was natural, then, that reggae would provide a kind of musical lingua franca amongst the decolonizing nations of Africa during this period. His song, Cocody Rock, provides an illustrative example of the trans-diasporic linkages evidenced in the flow of reggae from Jamaica to globally dispersed locations. First, the face-to-face intercultural music making embodied by the song, people in the room together making music together here at a studio in Kingston, demonstrates the growing interconnection between Jamaica, reggae's symbolic birthplace, and other communities of musicians and listeners. This case is especially important because it links the Jamaican popular music scene with specific musicians in West Africa. And second, the song's title and lyrics profess a connection between Kingston and Abidjan, the capital city of Côte d'Ivoire. Indeed, in a loose but very tangible way, Cocody Rock is a kind of dubbing of the 1973 Wailers song Trenchtown Rock. The Wailers' Trenchtown Rock focuses on the area of Kingston, thanks, while Cocody focuses on a neighborhood in Abidjan. The strategic connection of Trenchtown and Cocody creates more than the sound bridge that Chude Soke so eloquently illustrates about roots reggae. It further suggests that globally dispersed musicians map their lives in ways that create strategic connections to other musicians and communities. They map the reggae nation through the exchange of symbols, musical, religious, racial, and so forth, and through face-to-face, international, intercultural musical encounters. Whether backstage, corporeal, in the flesh, these encounters provide an immediacy and physical manifestation of imagined communities, to borrow from Benedict Anderson. I'm going to move forward a little bit here. My final example shows how reggae transnationalism transposes across different types of cultural, linguistic, and ethnic boundaries. Although the two examples so far reveal a flow of Afro-Jamaican culture in African and African diasporic communities, there are almost countless outposts in the reggae nation that host a blending of global reggae culture with local cultures that demonstrate other kinds of transnational linkages. Notable examples include Jawaiian reggae from Hawaii, Maori reggae in New Zealand, or even reggaeton in Latin America. These demonstrate James Clifford's observations that, quote, the articulation of reggae with indigenous projects in the Pacific and elsewhere is a resonant, if unorganized form of, quote, globalization from below. So the last example I'm going to talk about is from a San Diego, California-based reggae group called Elijah Emmanuel and the Revelations. Elijah's real name is Elias Hernandez. He was born in Cologne, Panama, and split his early childhood between Cologne and various cities in the U.S., eventually settling in San Diego as a teenager. Elijah's group primarily performs at venues in Southern California. It's comprised of local reggae, jazz, and funk musicians. In the last few years, they've begun to perform more regularly in Mexico and New York and other places in the West Coast. I'm going to speak now briefly about a song of his called Yo No Soy Ilegal, which is the words from the chorus of the song. It's basically a song about decriminalization of immigration movements across the border between Mexico and the U.S. Written before the increased militarization of the Mexico-U.S. border and the post-9/11 political climate, Elijah's songs speak remarkably well to current debates about immigration policy, the policing of national borders, and the isolationist stance of the Bush administration that belies the transnational makeup of many American communities, maybe even the Obama administration now. The question I'd like to pose concerns the relationship of legal membership to national and transnational communities. Much of Elijah's Spanish language au revoir maps a kind of pan-Latin American identity that resonates well with contemporary Chicano activism in the U.S. and related activist movements throughout Latin America. In the intro to Yo No Soy Ilegal, Elijah recites the names of several important historical figures in Latin American activism, Pancho Villa, Emilio Zapata, and Che Guevara. Invoking these historical figures positions his assertion that yo no soy ilegal, thanks, I'm not illegal, and sigo cruzando fronteras, sigo luchando, I'll continue crossing borders, struggling. He situates this within a much larger discourse about colonialism and national independence in Latin America. Elijah's music differs dramatically from commercial trends in Spanish-language reggae today. Reggaeton has become the sine qua non of reggae in Espanol, a phenomenon that began with the commercial success of fellow Panamanian rapper and dancehall reggae singer El General in the mid-1980s. Elijah's music, on the other hand, is emblematic of a roots revival in Spanish-language reggae, a trend that reappropriates the activism of Rasta-informed reggae. Jamaican scholar Horace Campbell argues, quote, the cultural resistance from the hills of Jamaica and the symbols of defiance become their form of resistance as they attempt to create their own cultural institutions. These cultural institutions take many forms: local Rasta communities, national and international touring circuits, reggae communities that congeal around various intersecting agendas and activist issues as well. We can see in Elijah's music an aggressive agenda of denationalizing political nation-states that serve to dissect and compartmentalize Latin American ethnicities, indigenous cultures, indigenas, and their connections to Caribbean culture and the African diaspora. Yet this agenda is also one of renationalizing musical and cultural identities in new transnational ways, not as a kind of immigration-based long-distance nationalism, but as a progressive transnation that resembles the global citizenship paradigm brought forth by Darren O'Byrne and others. Which brings me to just a really brief and abrupt conclusion here. The examples that I've shared with you demonstrate how a discourse within the globalized reggae world, what I've been calling the reggae nation and reggae transnation, is articulated in specific musical examples and the social strategies employed through lyrics and other musical means. These emergent forms of transnationalism in reggae seem to fall outside of the frameworks proposed by transnational studies theorists. Instead, the reggae transnation illustrates an intercultural and global sound politics that seeks to transcend the nation state, and much like Doug, it floats in a world of shifting symbols and soundscapes. Thank you.
Okay, I stand before you as, to quote Gayatri Spivak, a white boy talking post-coloniality. She means this sarcastically, of course, as a dig at the mainstream appropriation of post-colonial theory by a predominantly white Anglophone academia. But it's easy enough to draw on other aspects of her work to read this statement quite differently. Given her critique of the metaphor of voice and authenticity as tropes for articulating the real experience of the oppressed, the reference to white boys talking post-coloniality, or reggae in this context, can be taken positively as an invitation to rise above identity politics and confront the complexity that connects us all, which is just what reggae, which is now thoroughly global, has done and continues to do. What I will be primarily interested in is the tension between particular and universal, local and global. I will argue that this tension is not simply a matter of the forced commingling of cultures in the context of globalization, a discourse which tends to keep the idea of purities which are only now being sullied, which I think is probably false, but rather that this tension is intrinsic to any emancipatory discourse, which is what I take conscious roots reggae to be. My paper will have three sections. Firstly, I will characterize Rasta-influenced roots reggae as, to borrow a phrase from Oliver Feldman, a logic of incompletion. Secondly, I will explore how this logic of incompletion adapts as it crosses cultural, social, political borders through the example of British dub poet Linton Kwesi Johnson. And thirdly, I'll be making a brief distinction towards the end, if Sonia is kind enough to give me the time, between two kinds of universalism, inclusive and divisive, with which to defend the importance of reggae as a rebel music equipped both to challenge the iniquities of economic and cultural globalization and to resist the facile forms of commodification. One then, roots reggae as a logic of incompletion. I would contend that the emergence of reggae music really cannot be separated from the influence of Rastafari, and that both need to be thought within the long history of counter-colonial struggles among Africans in Jamaica. I would also contend that this history is not finished, and moreover, that it can only problematically be claimed as exclusively Jamaican. Indeed, it has been against the dominant constructions of Jamaican national identity that Rastafari and reggae have emerged. Simplifying crudely, I would emphasize three key motifs in Rastafari that are carried over and indeed amplified in roots reggae music. One, the cultivation of a deep historical consciousness, felt and lived in the present. Two, the deployment of this black historical consciousness against the state's attempts to narrate away the continuing injustices of this history of suffering. And three, the core spiritual but also political message of love, peace and unity. Each of these contributes to what I am calling a logic of incompletion. Historical consciousness. The insistence on the greatness of pre-European African civilizations mobilizes a black history against the dominance of white-centric colonial history, disrupting or incompleting it. But this is far from a scholarly matter alone. Rasta attitudes to the Bible exemplify the fuller logic of incompletion that I'm trying to get at. A willfully strong hermeneutic turns it into a product of the distortions of the white man that can nonetheless be read against itself and to produce truths that can actually structure attitudes in the present, how you live your life. It's not about remembering the greatness of Africa then, but of actually living it. Religion has played a vital and complex role in sustaining a resistant black imaginary in Jamaica in several historical stages. There was the struggle to maintain African rites and rituals under the conditions of slavery in the form of Obi, Maoism and Kumina. Then there was the influence of nonconformist British missionaries who arrived on the island in the mid to late 18th century, Baptists, Moravians, Methodists, politicising the exploited blacks against the reigning plantocracy, as well as spearheading the campaign for the abolition of slavery back in England. Just prior to the explosive Morant Bay Revolt in 1865, sparked by the black preacher Paul Bogle, a massive island-wide upsurge in religiosity was observed in 1860 and termed the Great Revival. And then, following Morant Bay, the emancipatory dimension of religion in Jamaica came through syncretic native church movements that took elements of Christianity and blended them with surviving African forms, resulting in hybrid formations such as Pukamina and revivalism. Rastafari draws on this long tradition of religiously inspired resistance, and did so musically even prior to the emergence of reggae. The incorporation of Buru drumming into the Nyabingi rhythms of Rasta chants resurrected an African beat that was slower, heavier, more dread than other forms of music imported even from the wider black diaspora, such as American jazz and R&B. By the time Count Ossie had transferred Buru-based drumming patterns into the recording studio and produced what many musicologists regard as the first reggae record, O Carolina, Africa had arguably come to life within British colonial Jamaica. Explicitly in the roots reggae of the 70s, we have both a lyrical invocation of an ancient Africa and a musical form that put an African aesthetic to work in a demographic context which is obviously predominantly African, but still structured socially and politically in a kind of British way. Africa, or Ethiopia, is less a simplistic yearning for geographical repatriation then, or not only that, but also a challenge to the attempted symbolic closure of the Jamaican nation. This is why the critique of Babylon and the politricks of which it is evidently capable is so crucial to roots reggae. The biblical resonances of the term enable it to encompass historical and contemporary forms of exploitation. Old and New Testament themes of exile, greed, opposition to God and imperial violence intertwine and mingle with black diasporic experiences of slavery, colonialism, and also post-colonial first world hypocrisy. And the example that leaps to my mind is obviously the IMF loans and the effect they continue to have on the Jamaican economy. In Bob Marley's song Babylon System from the 1979 album Survival, he compares famously Babylon to a vampire sucking the blood of the sufferers against which they must rebel. Later in the same album, he pithily condemns the exploitative economics of Babylon as Pimper's Paradise. Moreover, in an exemplary chapter in her book, Sound Clash, Jamaican Dancehall Culture at Large, Carolyn Cooper not only charts the injunction to bun down Babylon in roots reggae music, but also its continuity into the work of dancehall artists like Capleton. Among many other things, Babylon is the state that pretends to include everybody equally, but in the very same gesture effectively excludes the real sufferers. This is where historical consciousness overlaps with political critique. So when Burning Spear asks, do you remember the days of slavery, he's not asking for certain textbooks to be prioritised in the school curriculum. I think it's a challenge to live a relation to the ongoing injustices of slavery and indeed their contemporary forms, including mental slavery. Likewise, when he laments the fact that no one remembers old Marcus Garvey, it's crucial to see this as an intervention into a particular context when the post-independence Jamaican state was attempting to reimagine national identity. To accept the completed version of Jamaican nationalism as out of many one people would be to deny the very inequalities out of which and against which both Rastafari and reggae have emerged. The irony of branding Jamaica for the outside world with the smiling face of a dreadlocked Rasta is therefore extremely paradoxical. Babylon has always been Jamaica itself. When Leonard Howe first declared that, quote, Rastafari is King of Kings and Lord of Lords, the black people will no longer look to George V, the British king, Rastafari is their king, end of quote. It was a strategy of incompleting British sovereignty over the island of Jamaica. Love, peace and unity. one of the core messages of roots reggae, in stark opposition to those elements of dancehall culture influenced by the gangster chic of American hip-hop, is the need for an end to fussing and fighting in favour of universal love. However, here I would insist on a distinction that needs to be made between what on the one hand we might call a kind of hippie California version of love, one thoroughly embedded in a middle-class, predominantly white countercultural movement, and something much more rooted in the experience of working-class, racialized marginalization. And yet love in Rasta reggae is not at all the bland multi-culti togetherness which national governments dependent on the tourist dollar end up projecting to the outside world. On the contrary, I would argue that it has much more in common with the revolutionary practice of satyagraha developed in colonial South Africa and India by Mahatma Gandhi, in which a militant solidarity is built upon the recognition of a common humanity, both prior to and above and beyond the differences so helpful to colonial divide and rule tactics. Love, then, is the dissolution of those divisive differences by which states attempt to order societies. In the context of politically funded gang warfare, this image is both unifying and explosive, indicating to the manipulated poor that they need not fight other people's battles, and to the crazy bald-head politicians that people power is bigger than Babylonian state power. But how does this logic of incompletion, which I'm ascribing to conscious roots reggae, function as it travels beyond the rock and circulates not only amongst the global African diaspora, but amongst the cultural flows of late globalized capitalism? 2. England is a bitch, Linton Kwesi Johnson. To answer, or at least address this, I now turn to the celebrated British dub poet Linton Kwesi Johnson. Johnson was born in 1952 in Chapelton in Jamaica, but moved to London before his 10th birthday. It was the experience of cultural dislocation and racism in the ghettoized Caribbean communities of Brixton, Peckham and Lewisham that radicalized the young Johnson, leading him to join the Black Panthers while still a schoolboy, and then to involvement with the Race Today collective. His journal was edited by Darcus Howe. Around the time that other British reggae bands were emerging, such as Birmingham-based Steel Pulse and London's Aswad, Johnson also hooked up with a band utilising Nyabingi rhythms called Rasta Love. Although Johnson is not a Rasta, he acknowledges the importance of Rastafarian images and concepts in his music and poetry. His work redeploys the 3 Rasta motifs I've identified, but there's a change in the transition to the British context. Johnson's verse of the 70s is the most militant and the closest to Rasta themes. The poem Reggae Sounds declares that bass history is a moving, is a hurting black story, arguably playing with the double meaning of bass as musically resonating in the lowest rumbling registers, but also as debasement, dehumanization, denigration of basic human rights. In the same poem, fire and brimstone imagery mixes with the sense of impending riots. Flame rhythm of historical yearning, flame rhythm of the time of turning, measuring the time for bombs and for burning. In other works, such as Come We Go Dung There and All We Doing Is Defending, there is a Fanon-like emphasis on the necessity of a violent tipping point in the dialectical struggle for recognition amongst British blacks during that period. Johnson has certainly studied Frantz Fanon's writings on colonial desire and the role of revolutionary violence. Perhaps as a result, history in Johnson's poems becomes a history of pain that gathers inexorably into imminent violence. However, throughout the seminal 1978 album, Dread Beat and Blood, there is a pervasive mood of simmering, barely suppressed frustration. Sometimes the poet acts as a rabble-rouser advocating the lifting of the lid from this social pressure cooker, as in the promise in All We Doing Is Defending that we will fight you in the street with we hand, we have a plan, so listen man, get ready for take some blows. And in time come, fruit soon ripe, fi take we bite, strength soon come, fi we fling we might. And we're going to smash the sky with we bad blood. However, often at the very same time, the poet is offering a warning to the wider community. It soon come, look out, look out, look out. And in the last couplet, it too late now, I did warn you. This use of the phrase soon come is the site of a politicizing re-inscription, typifying the supposed lassitude of the average indolent Jamaican, as putatively lazy as their slave forebears. And obviously, non-cooperation, I think, was a militant tactic during the period of slavery. It's not laziness. Soon Come here invokes the opposite, a visceral urgency coiled like a snake in the bodies of angry British blacks, and this coil was in fact unleashed spectacularly during the 1981 riots in Brixton and Toxteth. Arguably, however, Johnson's approach to history is focused less on the ancient Ethiopian past and more on a social history of the present. He's at his best in these poems of the 70s when he is opening a poignant vignette onto the everyday realities of racist Britain. Poems like Sonny's Letter and Street 66 vividly document the brutality of white British police against the whole Caribbean community. In the former, a son writes home to his mother from Brixton Prison, having dared to resist police aggression, while the latter recounts the random house raids that were typical for West Indian residents in London at that time. Just as Rastas in Jamaica had long endured the unwarranted attentions of the JCF, so black Britons in London, Liverpool, Birmingham and Manchester in the late 70s were subjected to invidious stop-and-search policies. The concept of Babylon was able to straddle this transatlantic experience. Moreover, Johnson punctuates this account of racism with proper names that stand for the injustices of Babylon. Take, for example, the song It Dread in England, dedicated to George Lindo, a Jamaican living in Bradford in the north of England, who was wrongfully convicted of armed robbery. Unlike the poem in its initial textual form, the song opens with the unmistakable sounds of a street protest. A crowd chants angrily, and the poet's declaration comes demagogue-style through a megaphone. The song both documents an injustice and galvanizes a struggle for justice. As Fred Daguiar has argued, quote, Linton's work chants back to life the conscience of a society put to sleep by greed. Indeed, the cumulative repetition of proper names relating to moral outrages constitutes a leitmotif in Johnson's oeuvre. If I only have a couple of minutes left, or probably 1 minute, I'll simply conclude by summarising my argument, which is essentially that Johnson's poetry in the British context takes those three motifs that I pulled from Rastafari to do with historical consciousness, the critique of Babylon, and love, and transforms them. Historical consciousness becomes more like a document of the present, a social history of the present. The critique of Babylon focuses on the injustices of the police, because that was the front end of racism during that period. And love comes to be articulated in terms of his socialism, his commitment to socialism, and the idea that there is a global common humanity, and that can be a force for resistance. I'll stop there. Thank you.
The title of my talk is Race, Reggae, and the Search for Self, Japan's Literary Excursions into the Jamaican. This paper belongs to a broader study of Jamaican culture, mainly dancehall, roots reggae, and Rastafari in Japan. The current vogue of dancehall in Japan is largely the result of two high-profile victories by Japanese reggae performers in international competition. In World Clash 1999, held that year in Brooklyn, New York, Mighty Crown, a Japanese sound system, was the only non-Jamaican competitor in the field and surprised the international dancehall community by winning the event. 3 years later, Junko Kudo, a dancer part of Japan's burgeoning Danet scene, became the first non-Jamaican to compete in Jamaica's National Dancehall Queen Contest in Montego Bay. In what was for the dancehall community a perhaps even more surprising turn of events than the Mighty Crown victory, Kudo also won her event. While dancehall is primarily still an underground movement in Japan, one measure of dancehall's popularity today has been the success of Yokohama Reggae Sai, an event organized by Mighty Crown Entertainment. In 2006, this event has filled Yokohama Stadium with approximately 30 to 40,000 fans, making the event arguably the largest one-day reggae event in the world and almost certainly the most profitable. Another major event has been the One Love Jamaica Festival, which has attracted each year about 30,000 fans over the course of 2 days. Now, in my research, I use Japanese engagement with Jamaican culture to consider such aspects of Japanese social identity as gender, class, regional differences, and so forth. However, I focus on race. I argue in this paper that the representation of Jamaicans is very specifically seen in works of fiction and nonfiction by Japanese people traveling to Jamaica is often crafted in a way that facilitates reflection on what it means to be Japanese. What then is the modern socio-historical context for the reception of globally circulated ideas of racial blackness? With the arrival of the specifically Western idea of race, blackness in Japan has come to take on many of the expressive forms with which it has been associated in the West. And if I had the visuals that went along with this presentation, you get a sense of what these images are like. You know, black face, white lips, bone through the nose, those kinds of iconographies that we associate with the West were very much present in Japan up until very recently and can still be found even to this day. Part of Japan's early westernization in the late 1800s includes its incorporation of an entire panoply of images as well as performance traditions drawn from Europe and America, including blackface. Despite efforts to clean up these images in response to international criticism in the early 1990s, they can be found in the country even today, albeit in diluted form. But even diluted, these images raise the question of what meaningful distinction can be made between the supposedly innocent commodification of blackness as cute, as cool, as something worth idolizing and imitating on the one hand, and grotesque on the other. Now, most Japanese encounter real black people for the first time in the way of international travel, including in order to learn about black cultural forms like reggae music from the source. Over the last few years, hundreds of Japanese youth, part of Japan's flourishing reggae scene, have traveled to Jamaica. Rather than the sheltered tourist resorts of Ocho Rios, Negril, and Montego Bay, these Japanese youth travel to Kingston. They don't stay only for a few days at a time, but rather months or even years, living in one of few all-Japanese residential complexes in the city. They travel from studio to studio, reggae event to reggae event, absorbing the Jamaican experience. Now, while Japanese have long sought out the nooks and crannies of the cultural globe, what is significant about how it's being done today, I would argue, is the way in which this effort is linked to the discourses of Jibun Sagashi. This so-called search for self has been a major buzzword in Japanese public discourse since at least the early 1990s. With the bursting of the economic bubble in 1991, there was in the so-called lost decade of the 1990s, and strongly remains today, a pronounced sense that Japan is in crisis. From the weakening of the vaunted system of lifetime employment to the relegation of job-hunting youth to frita, or free-timers only able to work on a part-time or temporary basis, to several high-profile murders committed by disturbed youth in this historically low-crime country. Emerging out of the sense of crisis, the search for self invokes a recent preoccupation in the Japanese public sphere with the stories of businessmen who quit their jobs to spend more time with their children, college graduates who become activists for little or no pay, and so on, all in search of new, more fulfilling ways of living and being. Even where Japanese youth do not travel out of an explicit, self-conscious, and somewhat corny-sounding desire to search for themselves, even where this travel might be seen as more directly driven by love of reggae music and interest in Rastafari or other things with which Jamaica is associated, the discourse of self-searching remains significant as a powerful social method that discreetly facilitates recognition that there are strategies of lifestyle design beyond the narrow ones prescribed by Japan Incorporated, as well as brings through the mass media examples of how to pursue them. Now here I'd like to briefly explore how the search for self manifests itself specifically in fiction and nonfiction writing by Japanese people traveling to Jamaica, and the ways in which Japanese figurations of blackness importantly inform representations of this encounter. A common theme uniting both sets of works, both fiction and nonfiction, is the writer's sense of Jamaica and Jamaicans as being bad, but vitalizing and endearing. I'll mention one work of nonfiction and one work of fiction. In her nonfiction book, Honjama Jamaica, Yuko Kimoto describes her 3 trips to Jamaica. Her anxieties about being in Jamaica are inflected in terms, or according to, and made in a sense more urgent by the fact that she's a woman. Kimoto is struck by the constant efforts of the Jamaican men she meets to cheat her and get her into bed. There are many of these bad men in Jamaica, Kimoto writes, but they're much, and this is a quote, they're much, much more interesting than the good guys. Now, these tricksters are bad in a way that only makes one smile bitterly. Their badness is not often malicious, and it even has a certain charm. Now, Kimoto reminisces about riding on the back of a motorbike with a male Jamaican friend. She remembers the terrible pleasure of the bike speeding roughly over the pebbles, the harshness of the wind at her ears. Somehow in these moments, Kimoto writes, she feels she is able to live life with intense pleasure. Jamaicans live in a violent country, and this is a direct quote, their way of having fun is violent. Riding without a helmet, pebbles, squalls, muddy roads, and darkness, every bit of it was scary for soft, civilized me. But when you get past the fright, you trust the pebbles and the squalls and the darkness, you even come to enjoy them. Once you fully undergo this process, your way of living sharply changes. The Jamaican experience then can be violent and terrifying but transformative because it provides Japanese travelers a means by which to live intensely pleasurably outside of their soft, civilized first world selves. Now, these particular representations of Jamaicans in Jamaica as tough and bad are not exactly racial. They're more global Southern from, of course, the global Northern perspective. At points in Kimoto's text, however, these representations become specifically racial. After her first experience smoking marijuana, she becomes paranoid and believes that the Jamaican men she is traveling with intend to assault her. She jumps out of the speeding taxi, runs to a nearby house, and begins banging on the door. Now, a white man emerges. She explains to him that she is being pursued by strange men. The author at this point confesses with embarrassment to the reader that she felt she could trust the white man because, and this is a quote, he was white, so it was okay. In these dangerous situations, one's true human feelings come out completely. Life in places like Jamaica become a crucible in which rarely elaborated on ideas of racial difference in Japan, despite the myth of Japan as a society unconcerned with race, are revealed in their purest form. In other works, such as by a writer named Jahiro, who is Japanese, preoccupation with the difference of blackness is even harder to miss. His novel entitled Rastaman Vibration tells the story of Goro, a construction worker disaffected with his life in Tokyo. Much of this intensely polemical novel is guided by the author's desire to challenge what he sees as the repressive homogeneity of life in Japan. The novel strives for a politically progressive stance in which Goro comes to realize the interconnectedness of Babylonian corruption in Japan as an extension of that found in the West and throughout the Third World. The harsh Jamaican experience that Goro must undergo to achieve this realization, however, is significantly expressed not only through scenes of poverty and violence in Jamaica, but through constant representations of Jamaican blackness which work partly to foreground, I argue, his identity as Japanese. The political sensitivities evident in much of Rastaman Vibration do not extend to the overwhelming need to communicate to uninitiated Japanese readers back home just how black people really are. Now, Jamaicans read in much of this novel then like an avalanche of racially fetishized body parts: black hands, black chest, black skin, black faces, black fingers. And I had a quote in the presentation, but I'll see if I can play with the text here so that it makes sense. The blackness of Jamaican travelers at an airport where Goro is in New York, where he's preparing to depart for Jamaica, right? So the blackness of these Jamaican travelers is made into a force with which Goro politically identifies, keeping as it does the few white travelers in their place, so to speak. But then, as he arrives in Jamaica and is surrounded by beggars, the limits of this identification are disclosed in the way he instinctively shrinks back from their black faces. In spite of his intellectual embrace of blackness, one he needs in his search for a politically enlightened self, Goro remains alienated from it. Let me just close here. A key aspect of Jabun Sagashi as reflected in these works concerns its performative aspect. These publicly consumed narratives, in representing the actualization of fictional selves, cite not only the authority of what lies outside Japan, the so-called real world, but also ultimately the authority of Japaneseness. In the sense, the search for selfhood that would seem to upset notions of Japan as socially homogeneous is ultimately conservative. Even as they appear to challenge Japaneseness by supposedly leaving it behind, these stories remain informed by and recite a persistent, authoritative vision of Japan as necessary point of return. After her compelling encounter with Jamaica, Kimoto returns home. Goro returns home, seeding the lessons learned in Jamaica in the soil of his new life in Japan. Storytelling is always reflexive, not only in the sense that it reveals something about the protagonist qua storyteller, but also in the sense that as a co-construction between storyteller and audience, it reveals something of the social values linking both. Not only the character's presently known self, not only the self being searched for, but also the rhetorical codes through which these are expressed and through which the distance between them traversed must, to some degree, be familiar to both reader and writer. Blackness is one of those rhetorical codes shared by many Japanese writers and audiences. In the works touched on here, blackness is the exemplar of a difference which, learned and therefore tamed in the forbidding spaces of the global South, valorizes Japan, its purity, its accomplishments. I hasten to add strongly, however, that those Japanese travelers who do not write for or who do not feel a need to indulge Japanese readers with stereotypes about blackness might tell different stories. It is with these visitors, I think, that the possibilities of an Afro-Jamaican blackness understood in fuller, more complex terms most fully lies. Thank you very much.
Our next presenter is Michaela Montevecchi, and her paper is entitled In a Jamaican-Italian Style, Mutual Cultural Influences via Reggae and Rastafari.
First, as what I'm going to talk about today is cultural exchanges and historical connections via music, I will mainly borrow terms and concepts from the field of cultural studies, precisely from its music studies branch, and I will employ theoretical tools derived from post-colonial studies in relation both to some youth practices and to post-colonial Italy. Second, I would like you to know that since the knowledge I'm going to share with you is the result of a work in progress research, my presentation does not claim to be neither comprehensive nor exhaustive of the multifaceted Reggae and Rastafari Italian context. Consequently, I will be glad to welcome any contribution from the House. Last, since I'm aware that I'm speaking a second language and that therefore you might have difficulties in understanding my accent, please feel free to stop me at any point in time and to ask me to repeat anything that does not result sufficiently clear to you. On the 10th July 2009, a very special event for the Italian reggae community occurred. Mr. Bunny Livingston, in contrast to what he had declared decades before, landed in Italy to sing at the 15th edition of the European Reggae Festival Rototom Sunsplash, which yearly takes place at the Rivellino Natural Park of Osoppo, a small village in the northeast of Italy. On the same day, during an afternoon press conference, Mr. Livingstone had announced his intention to devolve 1/3 of his cachet to the Italian Ethiopian Community Association and the remaining 2/3 to the local authorities of Abruzzo, the Italian southern region that had been struck by a disastrous earthquake some months earlier. In his own words, that choice had to be interpreted as a genuine act of reconciliation with Italy. Departing from this event, the present paper aims to offer a perspective of the existing cultural connections between Jamaica and Italy. As the paper's title claims, these connections comprise mutual influences. Nonetheless, the extent to which Jamaican culture has affected an important portion of the Italian youth subculture's world is much higher than the opposite process. Hence, I will start talking about the impact of reggae culture and Rastafari on the Italian youth landscape and in relation to the Italian enterprise in Ethiopia by going back to the mentioned event and to the location where it happened. The European Reggae Festival Rototom Sunsplash is certainly the most visible evidence of the cultural relationship existing between Jamaica and Italy. Set up for the first time in 1994 by a small group of friends who shared both the delight for reggae music and the will to promote it alongside Jamaican culture, the Rototom Sunsplash bears already in its name the connection to its famous Jamaican forerunner, the Reggae Sunsplash. In the About Us section of Rototom's official website, they state, during the 10 days festival, the park hosting the venue and the entire village, I would add, is converted in a multi-ethnic city inhabited by a community who share the utopian principles of freedom, peace, respect, and unity. What I find interesting in this statement, besides the use of three terms, peace, respect, and unity/einity, which recall Rasta talk, is the vision it evokes, namely the image of a community located in a demarcated space constituted of people with different origins whose collective sense of a shared culture and identity is created by music, precisely by reggae music. This connective property of music has been broadly analyzed concerning the practice of different diasporic populations to link themselves to a common culture, identity, and history. Paul Gilroy, for example, has addressed reggae music, observing its role and significance in articulating a shared sense of community among global African diasporas. Narrowing down the focus on the Italian reggae community, to which my analysis is devoted, Rototom Sunsplash provides a site where dynamics relevant to both youth resistance and dislocations operates. Of course, the dislocation to which I refer to concerning the Italian community is not a physical but a mental one. Indeed, we have learned from psychoanalysis that human beings can experience a condition of psychological spiritual displacement within their own environment when, for instance, recognizable political, cultural, and identitarian references are no longer available. From this point of view, the staying at the 10 days festival represents for the Italian reggae massive a sort of pilgrimage to an imaginary promised land. Even more for those who cannot afford a visit to Jamaica, reckoned the dreamland for its being the cradle of reggae music. Indeed, the part taken to the festival, along with the at least once-in-a-life visit to Jamaica, represents one of the necessary steps to get the true reggae man-woman license, in other words, to gain authority in the subject. I myself have been part of the Rototom's pilgrims, having thus the chance to observe the dynamics related to the journey. to a group of friends getting prepared to camp at the Rototom Sunsplash means involving themselves in a shared experience which creates the sense of belonging to a community. And indeed, if a sound system is part of that group, it is not rare to see its banner waving as a flag at the entrance of the yard, a borrowed term with which people used to define the camping lot where friends settled down. The Italian sound system's panorama characterizes a lively and for many reasons interesting aspect of the influence of reggae music and Rastafari culture. The sound system style started in Italy at the beginning of the 90s in combination with the mushroom of the first so-called self-managed social centers, namely places, mostly abandoned buildings, illegally occupied by a group of youth with the will of promote youth aggregation and resistance underground culture. Nowadays, sound systems represent a network that covers a large portion of the Italian peninsula, from north to south, eastward and westward. The sound system phenomena displays a wide range of connection to Jamaica via rituals that can be considered in some way similar to the colonial practice of colonized people who, in search for social approval, tried to absorb and reproduce by imitation the social and cultural customs of the colonizers. First, there is the question of vinyls versus CDs or laptop. Playing vinyls is one of the qualities through which a sound system gains unquestionable authority. That is mainly because vinyl is seen as the symbol of the linkage to a tradition, which would require also the possession of one's own woofer equipment, something that is far from being affordable for the majority of the Italian crews. Who plays tunes on CDs or laptop is generally, but not always, seen as unfaithful to the tradition, in some sense not creditable to bear the title of sound system. Second, there is the craze for dub plates, better if recorded live during organized dub plate session, usually before the artist's show. My personal experience as manager of the Chatterbox Bassa Sound system, who have been promoting reggae live shows for the last 4 years, has given me the chance to witness the excitement of young sound system runners on their way back home from the recording studio with a dub plate in a hand and a picture with the singer in the other. To put it with humor, they always remind me of those devotees who come to the Vatican State and return home with a picture of the Pope in the pocket and a souvenir reproducing St. Peter's Basilica in the suitcase. Anyway, dub plates are precious stuff in relation to clashes. The more dubs a sound system can fire against the rival crew, the more he is certified authoritative, making the victory closer and his fandom improved. Third, there is the employment of words and expressions derived from dread talk. This particular praxis does not involve only sound systems, but also the entire reggae Italian community. People used to address each other as breath and sis. They used to close a conversation or a meeting saying, bless, bless ya, or one love. Moreover, it is common custom among males to add the suffix man to their names. Besides that, there is also a good amount of word games, including morphological or semantic adjustments, similar to the ones detected by Velma Pollard in her study of Jamaican dread talk. To give just an example, some years ago, exactly in 2008, some local hemp shops owners were forced to cancel the hemp festival they had been organizing because the name they had chosen was reckoned offensive towards the Catholic Church. Indeed, the debated name would have been Ave Maria. a word game based on the ambivalent spelling of the name Maria and to the reference to the opening line of the homonymous Catholic prayer, whose translation from the Latin sounds more or less, "We greet you, Maria," which would have sounded to hemp fans' ears, "We greet you, ganja." The smoking of ganja, the practice to grow it despite it is regarded illegal by the Italian law, and the habit of proudly addressing oneself as ganja farmer represent a further connection to Jamaica and to Rastafari Hollywood. By the way, a couple of years ago, the first verdict for not guilty of ganja possession occurred, raising much debate on Italian newspapers. The defendant was set free due to his affiliation to the Rastafari faith. Nonetheless, it remained an isolated case that did not put the topic for any serious discussions on our government table. On the contrary, the so-called Fini Giovanardi Act on drugs smuggling and aiding has been recently used by local authorities in order to force Rototom organizers to cancel the coming Rototom 2010 edition and to find a location abroad. The news has generated a great amount of supporting initiatives, among which they worth special mention the Do Not Accuse Bob Marley movement pro-Rototom and Caroline Cooper's commitment to the cause by publicly showing her solidarity with the festival. This reproachful political maneuver, whose only aim was to get rid of a political itchy reality of cultural resistance in Italy, leads us back to the festival last edition and to Bunny Wailer's reconciliation with Italy. The occupation of Ethiopia by the fascists, to which Mr. Wailer's reconciliation refers, represents an historical knot that ties Italy and Jamaica via Rastafari, and in the context of the present paper, the point in time at which Jamaican-Italian cultural connections run in the opposite direction, from Italy to Jamaica, if we consider that, first, Rome, or rather the Vatican State, symbolized the Catholic Church moral corruption in Rasta imagery, is encapsulated in the Italian territory. And second, how the fascist enterprise in Ethiopia wrote a painful historical chapter of Rastafari promised land. Moreover, it also embodies a disgraceful chapter of Italian history, a piece of our past that has been removed from the Italian population conscience for a long time and that has undergone revisions and political propaganda surgeries. As the authoritative Italian historian Angelo Del Bocca observes in the introduction of a collection of essays entitled The Neglected History, Historical Revisionism and its Political Use in Italy, published in 2009, in the last 10 years, the political employment of our colonial history has generated the most strong and underhand attempt to remove the historical memory of the crimes Italians committed abroad in Africa, in the Balkans, and the Soviet Union. In another book entitled Italian Goodfellows, appeared in 2005, he also takes notice of the still existing myth of the Italian Goodfellow in relation to the fact that the majority of the Italians, when asked about their colonial past, even though they admit vaguely its existence, they used to say that after all they were not as cruel as other colonialist powers. And another authoritative historian, Nicola Labanca, in the preface of a further collection of essays significantly entitled The Gas of Mussolini, Fascism and the War Against Ethiopia, detects that in 1996, while on a hand the Italian government was admitting for the first time the employment of mustard gas against the Ethiopian population, on the other, no celebrations for the centenary of the Adwa War were tributed. In the same text, he also gives account of the fact that in Italian school, books of history relegates our colonial pasts to few marginal lines. In this context, it becomes clear the important role of Rastafari perspective of the Italian adventure in Ethiopia as an historical countervoice that can provide a significant cultural support to those Italian historians committed to the hard task of keeping alive a piece of our history which sooner or later we will have to face. At this point in time, I could keep on talking about other cultural features which have entered Jamaican culture, like, for instance, the connection between spaghetti western genre and rude boys, or between mafia style and dancehall. But I prefer to stop my presentation here, leaving the connection between Italian colonial past in Ethiopia and Rastafari's as a thought-provoking issue for discussion. Thank you.
One round of applause for our panelists again. We're doing very well for time. I'm going to open the floor now for questions directed to any of the panelists. Well, let me start by asking Marvin something that sort of jumped out at me in your presentation. Your notion of race, which you didn't quite define for us in your presentation, seems to circulate heavily between what's constituted as a biological and a social construct versus one that is steeped in a sort of nationalistic or concept of the nation. And I wondered, how would you respond to that?
That's a fair question. When we talk about race, and when we talk about race, not just in a single national context, but across national context, obviously there's going to be some degree of blurring in terms of exactly what we mean by this term. When I talk about race, I specifically in the Japanese context, I'm interested to note that you picked up those two basic themes or two basic currents in my use of the term race, right? The symbolic dimension, right? Rather the biological dimension, and as a kind of way of thinking about nation. And in the Japanese context, I think that, those two meanings are in fact conflated, right? So when you talk about race in Japan, one way of understanding race is in the biological sense, but I think most Japanese people don't necessarily identify themselves in racial terms, at least amongst themselves. So there's a scholar who feels that maybe the most productive way about thinking about race in the Japanese context is not so much as a vertical construct in which you have one race that's ranked higher or lower in relation to another race. A more productive way of thinking about race, again, in terms of nation, right? Again, conflating nation and biology, is as a kind of horizontal kinship, right, between people who identify themselves as Japanese. And so I think in that way, because but that's not to say also that in Japan people aren't aware of these distinctions that are drawn between whiteness on the one hand as something that's elevated, that's something regarded as privileged, and Japaneseness as something relatively marginal, and also blackness as even further below. So I think my conflation of race as both nation and biology is a reflection of both the horizontal and vertical way of viewing blackness. Again, in terms of this kinship that Japanese people feel amongst themselves, but that is not necessarily biological, right, the nation sense, but also vertical, realizing that Japanese want to place themselves in relation to this broader global hierarchy of race.
Any questions yet for any of our panelists?
I have a question to the last presenter, the Italian lady. As far as I know, in Italy, roots reggae is more popular than dancehall reggae. Am I correct?
Maybe this was true since some time ago.
Okay.
Now dancehall is becoming more relevant among youth or younger generations. So we are assisting at a shift in the younger generation's taste. But yes, roots reggae, conscious reggae is still very strong in Italy.
And I just wonder why, and then is that because what you were talking about, the Rastafari connection and then post-colonial connection? Is there any?
Yes, to me, this connection is important because nowadays music has become one of the most important cultural medias among young generations. I mean, especially in Italy, young people don't read so many books, but they listen to a lot of music. So the message conveyed through music becomes important for this reason, you know. That is really shameful, you know, but it is like that. We are a non-reading nation, but a nation of people who listen to music a lot. So that's why the connection becomes important.
Yes, I just wanted to ask you about follow-up on that presentation on the Japanese. And it's about the impact of their cultural immersion in Jamaica, particularly those who stay beyond a month and might go into a year or years. Then what's the end result when they return to Japan? Are they changed people? And then is Jamaica and Jamaica's culture, in a sense, reshaping the Japanese? In other words, is it a fleeting experience or is it transformational?
Right. I just want to add just a little bit to Cordell's question. Is there any way to interpret a kind of colonization in reverse then? That on the return of these Japanese persons who have immersed themselves in Jamaican culture, on their return to Japan, is there a kind of colonization in reverse?
So colonization in the sense of Japanese...
To use that imperial trope.
Okay, well... But I'm still trying to get my mind around the question. So you're saying colonization in the sense of Japanese people, like the Jamaican culture colonizing Japan in a certain sense?
What is their influence?
All right, that's a really interesting. Well, I think I can answer that question in a kind of empirical way. And what I mean by that is that an important part of understanding, the impact of reggae music and Rastafari and dancehall in Japan. I think an important thing to keep in mind always is that it's even though it's a huge subculture right now and it has a tremendous amount of vitality and force, it's still primarily a subculture, right? And I think at the same time, we also have to keep in mind that compared with Jamaica, Japan is a large country. Japan is a country of 125 million people. Right, Jamaica is a country of like 3 million, right? So when we look at what's going on in Japan and you see these thousands of people, 40,000 people, in the stadiums, the stadia filling, the stadia with these reggae events, that makes an impression on us. So I struggle to use the term colonization in that sense, just given that difference. Now, in terms of the gentleman's question about what happens to these Japanese travelers or visitors who stay for an extended period of time, I guess I can also just try to answer that question very specifically in two ways. And one is in the discursive sense, in the sense that you see in these stories, these novels, these works of nonfiction that I discussed in my presentation. And in those, I think it just depends. So for instance, in Rastaman Vibration by Jahiro, right, he is very much changed by his experience living in Jamaica, right, because he left Japan to come to Jamaica the protagonist anyway, Goro, right? He left Japan to come to Jamaica to escape, the kind of Babylonian corruption of Japanese society, and he goes back having encountered the simplicity and the purity in a certain sense, but also the danger and so on of Jamaican life. He comes back with a kind of simplified view, more straightforward, more uncomplicated view of the world, right? And I think, I don't want to monopolize the mic, but I think that can be problematic. Let me just, that kind of view of Jamaica as a place that you come to simplify your life, right? Because Jamaica is in fact a very complex place. The other thing I wanted to mention just very briefly is that maybe another way of answering your question is to think about the Japanese kids who are a part of dancehall culture, and they come here to learn patois, to learn the music and so forth. What they come back with in a very specific sense is the kind of cultural capital of being able to speak patois as people who are really into reggae music. And so when you return to Japan, back to the reggae scene in Japan, your ability to say that you lived in Jamaica for a certain amount of time conveys a certain degree of subcultural prestige, which you may or may not be able to take advantage of once you go back. So I hope in all of that I answered all your questions. So thank you.
Floor is still open for questions.
Okay, it's not really a question, just an observation. There was mention earlier of Jamaica as a symbolic birthplace of reggae. And then I think what became evident across the presentations, the fact that reggae has clearly become a conduit for resistance and, identity formation across different cultures. But I think it was Colin who made 2 points that stayed with me. One of, yes, this reggae has become this vehicle for all kinds of different things in different cultures. But I think you made the point, Colin, about the reality of this, the reality that gave reggae its presence, the Jamaican cry, against oppression. And you did mention the fact that it's not just remembering slavery, but the fact that people are experiencing slavery now. That the fact that a law was repealed, how many years ago, hasn't changed the fact of an experience that's still a Jamaican reality. And you mentioned the IMF, which, strikes a chord for Jamaicans right now. So I'm wondering, just for anybody on the panel, the fact that reggae has become this conduit for different peoples across the world to express themselves and form identity and so on, do you think we have lost a sensitivity to that context that, symbolically gave birth to reggae, the reality of a people struggling still with a slavery now and oppression now? Just throwing it out.
Thank you very much. You summarized really what I was trying to get at and why I was making this plea for characterizing reggae in a kind of transnational global market as still rebel music, because I think that is the strength and that's what makes it what it is. The reason I used this term, which is a bit unwieldy and incongruous in a way, this logic of incompletion, is about that word logic, because that's something that can play itself out differently in different contexts, right? So the Linton Kwesi Johnson example shows that the kind of resistance, the rebellious intent is still there and is still strong, but it has to change in different contexts. The danger, in a way, is about the commodification of reggae as it's turned to the outside world, which was obviously the case from the days of Bob Marley anyway. He's the product already of that international marketing. It was interesting listening to Olivia Grange last night. She spelled out very practical issues, but also used words which scared me. She was talking about a product and she was talking about the Jamaican brand. And I think there's such a delicate balance between those two things to be struck for musicians, especially those with a Rastafari commitment, to keep hold of that rebellious aesthetic. It's not just an aesthetic, it is a way of life. And make some money. There's no there need not be a contradiction between those two things, but I think it's hard to achieve that balancing act. So in a way, that's what I was pleading for.
Any other questions?
This is a question posed to my Italiano sister right there. Just to make a statement, we also as young people don't read much. I can say that. But we also listen to a lot of music, so it's interesting to hear that the same thing is going on in Italy. But yeah. My question is, what are the other forms of music that is popular in Italy? Like, I know, like, here, if we don't listen to dancehall, it's usually hip hop or R&B. So, what would be the other forms of music that young people are currently listening to in Italy?
Mainly, young people listen to, as you, hip hop, rap, and so on. If we talk about subcultures, otherwise, relating to the mainstream music market, they listen to every kind of pop music, going from Madonna to, I don't know, other young groups, the Muse, British music, and whatever. What I can say is that reggae music, as other type of music of, so to say, with African roots, constitutes mainly as the subculture portion of the market and the site where resistance is experienced every day.
Okay, thank you very much for your questions. Thank you very much to our panelists. I would like to make an announcement before you go. This afternoon, well, at lunchtime, noon, we have a session entitled Music and Lyrics, a year after the Broadcasting Commission's directives, which is going to be the screening of a television discussion right here in the multifunctional room. And this is really a special session. The Broadcasting Commission has been trying to get, in a sense, feedback from the general public about where, after the ban on daggering and related content, are we now in terms of our music and lyrics. So I invite you all to come. We will be here at 12 for the screening of that TV discussion in the multifunctional room right here. Thank you.